Something is wrong inside the Kremlin. Not the carefully managed theater of press conferences and staged military reviews that Russia presents to the world, but something deeper, something structural, the kind of wrongness that powerful men try to bury before anyone notices the smell. In early March 2026, Moscow went dark, not metaphorically. The internet went out, mobile networks cut, messaging applications silenced, and the silence, for those who know Russian history, was far louder than any explosion. Beginning on March 5, 2026, internet and mobile communications went dark across central Moscow, with disruptions concentrated particularly near sensitive military and security installations. The blackouts paralyzed normal business operations, restaurants unable to process reservations, retailers reporting chaos. The Kremlin's official response was a single word, delivered by spokesman Dmitry Peskov with the practiced blankness of a man trained never to answer a real question. Security. No further elaboration, no technical explanation, just security. The universal absolution of the Russian state. And yet, in the corridors of power, in the encrypted channels of military intelligence officers, in the whisper networks of Moscow's elite, the word being used was not security. The word being used was coup. A Telegram channel called VCHK-OGPU, which claims insider access to Russian security services, reported that authorities had implemented the communications restrictions specifically around key military and law enforcement sites, including, according to one source, the Lubyanka headquarters of the FSB, the Russian Presidential Administration, the Security Council building, and the Moscow City VIP skyscraper district. For Western analysts accustomed to reading Moscow through layers of obfuscation, that list of targeted sites was not incidental. It was a map of power, a map of the exact nodes that would matter in any internal struggle for control of the Russian state. To understand what is happening now, you have to go back almost 2 years. In May 2024, Vladimir Putin made a decision that surprised even seasoned Kremlinologists. He dismissed longtime Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu, replacing him with Andrei Belousov, a Kremlin economist with no military background whatsoever. Shoigu, a man who had served Putin since the early 2000s, who had built one of the most extensive patronage networks inside the Russian defense establishment, was reassigned to the Security Council, a position that sounds important, but which strips its occupant of the financial leverage and institutional machinery that is the actual currency of Russian power. Putin had moved Shoigu from the engine room to the observation deck. The message was unmistakable to anyone watching from inside the system. What followed Shoigu's removal was, by any measure, an extraordinary purge. Several dozen Defense Ministry officials have been arrested since 2024 in what observers have described as a systematic dismantling of his political network. Among those targeted were Shoigu's former deputies Timur Ivanov, Pavel Popov, and Dmitry Bulgakov. Ivanov, once one of the most powerful figures in Russian military procurement, was sentenced to 13 years in prison in July 2025 on corruption charges, including embezzlement and money laundering. He had allegedly accumulated enormous personal wealth while overseeing defense contracts worth hundreds of billions of rubles. His fall was spectacular and deliberate, a public execution of a political clan carried out in the language of criminal law. Then, on March 5, 2026, the same day Moscow's internet went dark, came the arrest that changed the temperature of everything. Ruslan Salykov, Shoigu's closest ally and former First Deputy Defense Minister, was detained and placed under house arrest. Salykov was not simply a bureaucrat. He was described in Russian political circles as Shoigu's Grey Cardinal, the behind-the-scenes architect of the former minister's institutional empire. Their careers had been inseparably linked since the 1990s, when Salykov followed Shoigu from the Emergency Situations Ministry to the governorship of the Moscow region and finally into the Defense Ministry itself. For nearly 3 decades, where Shoigu went, Salykov followed. He was not merely a subordinate, he was the institutional memory, the operational brain, the man who knew where everything was buried. Salikov now faces 12 counts of embezzlement, 2 counts of bribery, and charges of establishing a criminal organization, the most serious classification in the Russian legal arsenal, carrying up to 20 years in prison. The investigators allege that the criminal operation ran from 2017 to 2024, meaning it allegedly spanned the full duration of the Ukraine war's preparation and early execution. On March 12th, just 1 week after Salikov's arrest, Putin dismissed Pavel Konovalchik, an aide to the Security Council secretary who had joined Shoigu's apparatus in the summer of 2024. The purge had now followed Shoigu directly into his current office. The walls were closing in, and everyone watching could see it. According to analysts at Riddle Russia, Shoigu's enemies within the Russian elite are prepared to go all the way. The thoroughness with which his network is being dismantled demonstrates how sharply the degree of internal conflict within the power vertical has risen. One scenario being discussed in Russian analytical circles is that Salikov may eventually be pressured to testify against Shoigu himself, a development that would place the Security Council secretary in direct legal jeopardy and potentially force his resignation. It has been speculated that Shoigu could be offered immunity in exchange for voluntarily leaving his post, though as Riddle Russia pointedly notes, such guarantees in Russian practice rarely prove reliable. And then there is the matter of Shoigu's disappearance. Shoigu has not been publicly seen since March 5, 2026, the same day the internet went dark, the same day his closest ally was arrested. His silence is not unusual by Russian standards. Senior officials frequently vanish from public view for days or weeks. But the timing compounds a picture that is already deeply unsettling to analysts monitoring Russian elite dynamics. In a system where visibility equals survival, invisibility raises questions that no official will answer. Communications were jammed in June 2023 when Yevgeny Prigozhin led his failed coup bid and marched Wagner Group forces toward Moscow. 2 weeks before the March 2026 outages, Putin signed a sweeping law allowing the FSB to block electronic communications for security reasons without public explanation. The sequence is difficult to ignore. A law granting the state the power to silence its own communications infrastructure was signed, and within 2 weeks that power was used, precisely around the sites most relevant to an internal power confrontation. Whether this was preparation or reaction, it reveals a government acutely aware of its own fragility. Russia experts speaking to the Kyiv Independent have been cautious about the coup narrative. Anton Barbashin, co-founder of Riddle Russia, argued bluntly that if Russian elites had wanted Putin out, it would have happened in 2022, and Stephen Hall of the University of Bath called a coup unlikely as of today. These are serious voices, and they deserve serious weight. Authoritarian systems are not necessarily weakened by internal purges. Sometimes they are strengthened by them. Putin has used exactly this mechanism, the corruption charge, as political weapon, dozens of times over 2 decades to eliminate rivals while preserving the appearance of institutional legitimacy. The destruction of the Shoigu network may be, as some analysts contend, not evidence of the Kremlin's fragility, but of its continued operational competence. The Institute for the Study of War and the Critical Threats Project have documented the Kremlin's ongoing efforts to reassert control over the information space, expanding the FSB's legal power to order shutdowns, tightening censorship mechanisms across digital platforms. In this reading, the March blackouts were not a symptom of an internal uprising, but a rehearsal for one, a stress test of the regime's ability to cut information flows precisely and quickly in the event of a genuine crisis. The regime is not necessarily facing a coup. It may be practicing for the possibility of one. The Atlantic Council has noted that while there is no reason to expect an imminent collapse of the Putin regime, the end could come suddenly. Most studies of autocracies have concluded that the biggest single threat to regime stability comes from existing elites. Putin has governed for nearly a quarter century by keeping those elites fractured, competitive, and mutually suspicious. The Shoigu purge fits that pattern exactly. But there is a point at which a purge generates its own momentum, where the men being targeted calculate that compliance is more dangerous than resistance. Whether that threshold has been crossed or is approaching is the question no Western intelligence service can answer with confidence. Russia's public finances have been deteriorating steadily under the weight of the war. Bond issuance has surged more than 100% year on year, and the deficit has ballooned. A wave of new tax hikes, including raising the VAT rate, has been announced for 2026. Exiled opposition leader Mikhail Khodorkovsky told The Telegraph that Putin's anxiety over power transition is evident, noting that if Putin were to die or fall, Russia would have no legitimately elected successor, no legitimate courts, no parliament whose authority the population believes in. The succession question is not academic. It is the existential variable around which every calculation within the Russian elite is organized. John Herbst, senior director of the Eurasia Center at the Atlantic Council and former U.S. ambassador to Ukraine, told The Telegraph that the Kremlin is falling into paranoia, that Putin is searching for new enemies because the system requires them. Paranoia, historically, is both a symptom and a cause. The Soviet Union's final decades were characterized by exactly this dynamic, a leadership that grew more isolated, more suspicious, and more aggressive in its internal consolidations precisely because it sensed the ground shifting beneath it. Whether Putin's Russia is approaching that historical inflection point or whether the system retains the resilience to absorb these pressures remains genuinely uncertain. What is not uncertain is the pattern that has emerged in the first weeks of March 2026. A communications blackout across the capital, the arrest of the most senior surviving member of a former minister's inner circle, the disappearance from public view of the minister himself, a new law granting unprecedented authority to silence the nation's communications infrastructure, an ongoing purge that has now claimed at least 4 senior defense ministry officials and is visibly encroaching on the Security Council. These are not isolated events. They are data points in a constellation that spells, at minimum, a regime under extraordinary internal pressure, a leadership that is consolidating, purging, and digitally arming itself simultaneously. History does not always announce itself with fanfare. Sometimes it arrives in the form of a mobile network going silent in the middle of a Tuesday morning in Moscow. Sometimes it looks at first like a corruption case. Sometimes it sounds like a spokesman saying one word, security, and then saying nothing more. The question is not whether something is happening inside the Kremlin's highest echelons. The question, the only question that matters now, is what happens next.